The gavel dropped at the Austin livestock auction. My cousin Beatrice leaned over, her voice carrying across the VIP section. "Uncle Silas lost his bet," she smirked. "Time to pay your rent, Clara. Settle the invoice." I stared at the massive bill for the prize bull. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. Anger wasn't loud. It was clinical. I simply pulled out my debit card, handing over my entire life savings to fund their vanity. Have you ever been the silent investor in your family's delusions? Tell me your story in the comments below. As the auction clerk processed my card, I calculated the exact return on investment my Aunt Marion and Uncle Silas had extracted from me over the past 22 years. They had taken me in when my parents died, framing it as an act of profound charity. But charity implies a gift without expectation of return. My presence on their sprawling Texas ranch had never been a gift. It was a long-term lease, and the rent was always due. By the time I was 16, I wasn't a niece. I was unpaid agricultural labor. I had a natural aptitude for veterinary medicine. While Beatrice spent her summers at European retreats, I was knee-deep in mud, diagnosing hoof rot and delivering breached calves. I saved their commercial herds from outbreaks of bovine respiratory disease that would have cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. I was the silent partner keeping their empire afloat, yet I was consistently reminded that my seat at the dinner table was a privilege I had to earn daily. They had successfully executed the trap of cruel normalization. When you are raised in an environment where exploitation is framed as gratitude, your baseline for acceptable treatment becomes severely distorted. This normalization of cruelty is a highly effective business strategy for toxic families. It establishes a baseline where the victim believes that basic human decency is a premium upgrade they cannot afford. By framing my exploitation as standard operating procedure, they eliminated the need for physical coercion. I was managing my own indentured servitude, convinced that if I just worked a little harder, cured one more herd, or paid one more exorbitant bill, I would finally clear the imaginary ledger. Marion and Silas didn't physically chain me to the property. They used a much more efficient mechanism. Debt. Emotional debt. Financial debt. The perpetual narrative that I was a stray dog they had generously allowed to sleep on the porch. Every time I saved a prize heifer, Marion would pat my cheek and say it was the least I could do for the family that kept me out of foster care. Over time, you stop questioning the ledger. You accept that your value is entirely conditional on your utility. I didn't see their behavior as abusive because they had masterfully normalized the transaction. Love was a subscription service, and I was the one footing the bill. I put myself through veterinary school using loans and overnight shifts at an emergency clinic, all while remaining on call for their ranch. They never contributed a single dollar to my tuition. Yet, they claimed my degree as a family victory, a testament to their excellent upbringing. Standing in the auction arena, watching my bank balance drop to zero, I didn't feel despair. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. Beatrice was laughing with her friends a few seats away, celebrating her perceived dominance. Silas was shaking hands with rival ranchers, accepting congratulations for purchasing a bull he couldn't actually afford. They weren't a family. They were a failing corporation surviving on my stolen equity. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon some lingering sense of familial loyalty, some spark of regret for the bridge I was about to burn. But there was nothing. The emotional accounts were completely bankrupt. The transaction was over. I was finally ready to audit the books. Why did a licensed, talented veterinarian allow herself to be treated like an indentured servant? The answer lies in the invisible chains of the survivor. It is a psychological mechanism known as learned helplessness, a condition where a person is repeatedly subjected to an aversive stimulus that they cannot escape. Eventually, they stop trying to avoid the stimulus and behave as if they are utterly powerless to change the situation, even when opportunities to escape are presented. This learned helplessness prevents any action. Marion and Silas had engineered a flawless psychological prison. It was a prison without iron bars, constructed entirely of weaponized guilt and fabricated obligations. Every time I had considered packing my bags and leaving Texas, the invisible chains pulled tight. Silas would suddenly develop a mysterious health scare right before calving season. Or Marion would leverage the memory of my deceased parents, claiming they would be heartbroken to see me abandon the only family I had left. They manufactured crises that only I could solve, ensuring my utility remained high while my self-esteem remained critically low. They isolated me professionally. Whenever a rival ranch offered me a lucrative consulting position, Silas would sabotage it, claiming my exclusive loyalty belonged to the family brand. I was effectively blacklisted from external success, trapped in an ecosystem where they controlled both the supply of approval and the demand for my labor. This is the insidious nature of surviving long-term emotional exploitation. You become so adept at enduring the pain that endurance becomes your primary skill set. You mistake the capacity to suffer for strength. I had convinced myself that staying and taking the abuse was a noble sacrifice. I thought I was honoring my parents' memory by keeping the peace, but I wasn't honoring anything. I was simply defaulting to the path of least resistance, paralyzed by a conditioned belief that I possessed no autonomous value. The invisible chains had anchored me to a distorted reality, where my only worth was measured by how much weight I could carry for people who despised me. But as I stood in the auction house, holding a receipt for a bull I did not want, purchased for a man I did not respect, the mechanism broke. The learned helplessness evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating logic. They had pushed the transaction one step too far. By forcing me to bankrupt myself publicly, they hadn't asserted their dominance. They had severed the final thread of my perceived obligation. The psychological prison suddenly revealed its true nature, a flimsy construct built on my own conditioned compliance. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was methodical. I looked at Beatrice, then at Silas, and for the first time in 22 years, I didn't see my captors. I saw a pair of poorly managed liabilities. The invisible chains didn't snap. They simply dissolved into nothing. I was no longer a victim enduring a tragedy. I was a creditor preparing to collect. This shift in perspective was purely analytical. When you realize that familial love has been nothing more than a predatory lending scheme, the emotional fog lifts instantly. You stop asking why they don't love you and start asking how much they owe you. The helplessness was never a permanent state. It was merely a temporary lack of correct data. And right now, the data was overwhelmingly clear. They had operated with total impunity, assuming my compliance was a guaranteed fixed asset. They were about to discover that my compliance had actually been a highly volatile, short-term loan. Before I could step away from the clerk's desk, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the noise of the auction floor. "Cancel that transaction immediately." The entire VIP section went completely silent. Great-grandmother Eleanor, the 90-year-old billionaire founder of the ranching empire, stepped out from the shadows of the executive viewing box. She rarely made public appearances anymore, widely rumored to be confined to her estate. Yet here she was, her posture impeccable, supported by a silver-tipped cane, projecting an aura of absolute authority. Silas went completely pale. Beatrice dropped her champagne glass. Eleanor approached the desk, her gaze fixed on the clerk. "The purchase is void. The bid was fraudulent. My grandson does not have the capital to back it." She then turned her piercing eyes towards Silas and Marion. This brings us to the silent regret of the watchman. For years, Eleanor had observed the family dynamics from the periphery. She had watched them exploit my talents and drain my spirit. To the outside world, her silence looked like complicity. But in reality, it was a tactical observation period. She had been quietly auditing the family's morality, waiting for definitive proof of their systemic corruption before executing a total corporate restructure. "I have watched you treat Clara like a disposable asset for 2 decades, Eleanor stated, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "I stayed silent because I needed to map the exact parameters of your greed, but this ends today." She pulled a sealed legal envelope from her coat. "I met with my attorneys this morning. My will has been completely rewritten. Silas, Marion, and Beatrice are officially disinherited. Everything. The land, the operational assets, the liquid capital now belongs exclusively to Clara." The crowd erupted in hushed whispers. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She signaled to her attorney, who stepped forward. "This isn't just about a change in management," Eleanor continued, her tone dropping to a lethal calm. "It's about criminal recovery. 10 years ago, Marion and Silas liquidated the agricultural trust left by Clara's biological parents. You embezzled $2.5 million meant for her future, funneling it into your own failing investments." I stood frozen, processing the data. They hadn't just used me. They had robbed me. The poverty I had endured, the loans I had taken out for veterinary school, it was all entirely engineered by their theft. And the crowning insult, Eleanor added, pointing her cane at the prize bull waiting in the holding pen. "That animal you just tried to force Clara to purchase, its lineage traces directly back to the elite herd her father genetically engineered before he died. You stole her inheritance, and then you tried to make her buy back her own father's legacy to cover your gambling debts." The revelation was a tactical nuclear strike. The emotional impact didn't register as sorrow. It registered as a balanced ledger. They weren't just terrible relatives. They were financial criminals. I looked at Marion, who was now weeping, and Silas, who was frantically stammering denials. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that the audit had finally caught up to them. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. The silent watchman had finally delivered her report, and the findings were undeniable. Eleanor had weaponized her regret, turning her years of observation into an airtight legal indictment. The transfer of power was instantaneous and clinical. I had walked into this auction house as an indentured servant holding a fraudulent bill. I was walking out as the sole proprietor of a billionaire empire, armed with incontrovertible proof of their federal crimes. The scales of justice were finally balanced. The fallout was immediate, spectacular, and utterly predictable. The scandal ripped through the Texas agricultural community like a wildfire. In a desperate bid to manage the public relations crisis and salvage her crumbling social currency, Beatrice agreed to a live interview on the state's most prominent agricultural and business podcast. It was a calculated risk, an attempt to spin a narrative of elder abuse, claiming I had maliciously brainwashed our dying great-grandmother to steal the family fortune. I didn't try to stop the broadcast. I simply sat in my new executive office, opened my laptop, and watched the live feed. Beatrice appeared on screen wearing a carefully selected modest outfit, performing the role of the devastated, wrongfully accused victim. For the first 20 minutes, she recited her rehearsed talking points flawlessly. She spoke about family loyalty, the tragedy of cognitive decline in the elderly, and how I had supposedly manipulated my way into Eleanor's good graces. But she had underestimated the host, a seasoned investigative journalist who cared more about verifiable data than tearful anecdotes. "Let's pivot to the financial allegations," the host said, pulling out a stack of documents. "We have independently verified bank records showing $2.5 million transferred from Clara's deceased parents' trust into holding companies controlled by your parents. How do you explain the embezzlement?" Beatrice's carefully constructed facade cracked. "It wasn't embezzlement," she stammered, her voice pitching higher. "That money was absorbed into the general family operational fund. We raised her. We put a roof over her head." The host didn't relent. "You used funds legally designated for an orphaned child to finance your own luxury vehicles, European vacations, and this very public relations campaign. You stole her future." The pressure broke her. Beatrice's face flushed a deep, ugly red, and her composure disintegrated entirely on the live feed. "We deserved that money," she screamed, leaning aggressively into the microphone. "She was just a charity case. My parents sacrificed everything to take her in. That trust fund was our compensation for dealing with her. She owes us. We earned every single penny of that inheritance by putting up with her pathetic, boring existence." The silence in the podcast studio was absolute. The audio clip of her unhinged confession hit the internet before the broadcast even concluded. It was a masterclass in self-destruction. In less than 60 seconds, Beatrice had dismantled her own defense and publicly confessed to her family's misappropriation of funds. I watched the live comment section explode with universal condemnation. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I simply took a screenshot of the confession and forwarded it to my legal team with a single sentence. Add this to the discovery file. Beatrice hadn't just lost the public relations war. She had voluntarily provided the prosecution with a recorded confession. The trap had closed, and she had pulled the lever herself. This is the inevitable result when toxic entitlement meets objective reality. Beatrice had lived for so long in a bubble of fabricated superiority that she genuinely believed her family's comfort justified the theft of an orphan's legacy. She thought she could manipulate the public the same way she had manipulated me for decades. But the public didn't owe her any emotional debt. They saw her clearly. An arrogant, panicked liability, frantically trying to defend the indefensible. As the viewership numbers climbed into the millions, securing her permanent digital infamy, I closed the laptop. The viral execution was complete. The market had corrected itself, and Beatrice's stock had officially plummeted to zero. The legal proceedings that followed were brutally efficient. There were no prolonged courtroom dramas or emotional pleas for clemency. It was a straightforward forensic audit. Armed with Eleanor's airtight documentation and Beatrice's spectacular public confession, my legal counsel filed a comprehensive suite of civil and criminal charges. The district attorney indicted Silas and Marion for multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand theft. Within 90 days, the veneer of their aristocratic Texas lifestyle was completely obliterated. They were ordered to pay full restitution, plus 2 decades of compounded interest. To satisfy the judgment, the courts seized their personal assets. The luxury vehicles were repossessed. Their private accounts were frozen. The grand historical mansion they had occupied for decades was legally transferred into my name, and they were given exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. Watching them pack their belongings into a rented moving truck under the supervision of local sheriffs, I observed the illusion of power in an empty wallet. For their entire lives, Marion, Silas, and Beatrice had conflated their financial liquidity with inherent personal superiority. They operated under the delusion that their wealth made them biologically better, granting them a divine right to exploit those beneath them. But their status was merely a leased aesthetic, purchased with stolen funds. When you strip away the designer clothes, the country club memberships, and the expansive real estate, you force toxic individuals to rely on the actual currency of their character, and their accounts were devastatingly overdrawn. Without their stolen money to insulate them, they collapsed into pathetic, bickering shells of their former selves. Silas blamed Marion. Marion blamed Beatrice's podcast appearance. Beatrice blamed everyone but herself. They had nothing internal to sustain them because their entire identities were constructed around a bank balance that never rightfully belonged to them. Silas and Marion were sentenced to 5 years in a federal correctional facility. Beatrice, entirely cut off from the family wealth and publicly disgraced, was forced to file for personal bankruptcy. She relocated to a small apartment in a different state, taking an entry-level administrative job where nobody recognized her last name. Their sudden descent into poverty demonstrated a profound psychological truth. Bullies are inherently fragile. They require the artificial scaffolding of wealth and status to intimidate others. Once that scaffolding was dismantled, the underlying cowardice was exposed for the world to see. They didn't possess the resilience to survive hardship because they had never actually worked for anything they possessed. I had survived 22 years of their relentless psychological warfare, building my own career from nothing. They couldn't survive a single month without access to my stolen capital. The pasture had been purged of its rot, leaving the soil ready for new, healthy growth. I reviewed the final asset transfer documents with cold satisfaction. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about implementing a necessary market correction. They had acquired an asset, my inheritance, my labor, my dignity, through hostile and fraudulent means. I had simply leveraged the legal system to execute a hostile takeover of my own life, reclaiming my intellectual and financial property. The parasites had been surgically removed from the host organism, As the moving truck finally pulled out of the estate's massive iron gates, taking the last remnants of my abusers with it, I didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy. I felt the quiet, profound efficiency of a perfectly balanced spreadsheet. The debt was settled. 2 weeks after the asset transfers were finalized, great-grandmother Eleanor passed away quietly in her sleep. She died exactly as she had lived, on her own terms, with her legacy secured and her estate thoroughly immunized against parasites. I stood by her bed, holding her hand as she took her final breath. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I allowed the clinical detachment to recede. I let myself feel the grief of losing the one silent watchman who had finally stepped in to alter the trajectory of my life. The next morning, I officially assumed control of the empire. I didn't waste time looking backward. I immediately liquidated the toxic assets and underperforming sectors Silas had mismanaged. With the recovered capital, I established the Eleanor Foundation. It wasn't a vanity project. It was a highly targeted infrastructure designed to provide full-ride scholarships and operational grants to veterinary students who came from abusive or impoverished backgrounds. I was going to ensure that no one else had to endure what I survived just to earn an education. Simultaneously, I initiated a massive genetic recovery program. Using my veterinary expertise, I tracked down the scattered descendants of my father's original elite cattle herd. Over the next 6 months, I repurchased them, bringing the bloodline back to the land where it belonged. When the first new calf of my father's lineage was born on the estate, healthy and strong, I stood in the pasture and felt the final, lingering shadows of Marion and Silas evaporate into the Texas wind. The narrative had been successfully rewritten. I used to believe that being alone meant I was somehow defective, that my inability to secure my aunt and uncle's affection was a personal failure. Now I know that solitude is infinitely more valuable than being surrounded by people who constantly demand you diminish yourself to keep them comfortable. My father's legacy is thriving. The foundation is funding the futures of brilliant young doctors. And I am finally standing on solid ground, unburdened by the crushing weight of fabricated debts. As I look out over the sprawling acres that are now undeniably mine, I've come to realize that blood does not obligate you to endure abuse. We are conditioned by society to believe that family is an unbreakable contract, a mandatory subscription you cannot cancel regardless of how terrible the service becomes. But that is a lie designed to protect abusers. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But true forgiveness requires you to first acknowledge the reality of the damage done. I learned that cutting toxic ties is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you, and you cannot negotiate with people who profit from your pain. I had to stop viewing myself as a victim waiting for a rescue and start operating as the chief executive officer of my own existence. To anyone out there who feels trapped in the invisible chains of a toxic family, waiting for a ledger to balance that was rigged against you from the start, stop trying to earn their love. Audit the relationship. Look at the data objectively. If the connection is bankrupting your soul, you have every right to declare insolvency and walk away. You are not a charity case, and you are not a burden. You are an asset, and it is time to stop letting unqualified people manage your worth. I've come to realize that true family isn't something you are born into and forced to endure. True family is something you build, rooted in mutual respect, accountability, and genuine care. My ledger is finally clean, and for the first time in my life, I am operating entirely in the black.